Good morning and welcome everyone to our fourth seminar in our Going Digital series, Privacy and Cybersecurity in Latin America, organized by the Latin American Program and co-sponsored by our friends at the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI. I'm Benjamin Gadan, Deputy Director of the Latin American Program here at the Wilson Center. Today's dialogue on privacy and cybersecurity is part of our five-part series, Going Digital, featuring CEOs, senior policymakers, and other experts discussing the challenges and opportunities the region faces now that so many Latin Americans are very suddenly very much online. Our inaugural Going Digital event focused on the explosion of financial technology, or fintech, in Latin America, and the lessons learned from Uruguay, sometimes known as the Silicon Valley of South America. We heard insights from the CEO of dLocal, Uruguay's first unicorn, from Uruguay's ambassador to the United States, and from the CEO of Hackers and Founders. Our second Going Digital event looked at how to solve Latin America's shortage of digital workers. We heard insights from the CEO of Workana, Salesforce's Government Affairs Director for Latin America, and a senior advisor to Peru's Digital Secretariat. Our third Going Digital event on the future of digital trade showcased insights from Chile's Vice Minister for Foreign Trade, the CEO of Globant, and Amazon Web Services, Maria Inés Baquet, who previously served as Argentina's Secretary of Digital Government and Technological Innovation. I mention all this not to show off, but because all three webcasts are available on our website. We'll also find information on future Going Digital events, including our August 17th discussion on remote education in Latin America. Today, we will explore privacy and cybersecurity policies and the infrastructure needed to sustain Latin America's digitalization process, and to make sure Latin America's digital latecomers do not lose confidence in their newly adapted technologies. I want to let you know that you should participate in today's event as well. You can do so by sending us questions on Twitter, by direct message, or by tagging at LATAMPROG, at LATAMPROG, or simply by email to lap@wilsoncenter.org. That's lap@wilsoncenter.org. Amid the COVID-19 pandemic, Latin America continues to experience devastating public health and economic hardships. 1.3 million have died so far, and 22 million Latin Americans have fallen into poverty. As the highly contagious Delta variant spreads across the world, including in the United States and Latin America is particularly suffering because of generally slow vaccination rates. Little good has come from this monumental public health and economic tragedy. But the repeated experiments with social distancing have left one positive impact: rapid digitalization across multiple sectors, from banking, commerce, and cloud technologies to telehealth, telecommuting, and online education. Latin America's governments are also on board, as we'll hear from Miriam, rapidly expanding digital access to public services, including to distribute emergency funds to struggling families. These are welcome trends, especially in a region that had lagged behind in the use of digital technologies. But to retain the confidence of consumers, governments, lawmakers, and businesses in this region, all must pay more attention to privacy and cybersecurity considerations. And so far, the evidence is not encouraging. In a recent report, the Inter-American Development Bank and the Organization of American States warned that Latin America was, quote, not sufficiently prepared to handle cyber attacks. Only 7 of the 32 countries examined in the study had a critical infrastructure protection plan. 12 had not developed cybersecurity incident response teams. Fewer than half the countries studied had approved a national cybersecurity strategy. Latin American countries still have limited capacity to prevent or investigate cybercrime, including often inadequate legal frameworks. Just 5 have ratified the Budapest Convention, which facilitates international cooperation to address the cross-border nature of this digital menace. These sluggish government preparations raise the risk that data breaches and hacking could derail progress toward Latin America's digital future. After all, the region has historically suffered from high levels of fraud, including online, such as phishing scams and malware. Encouragingly, over the past decade, many Latin American governments have adopted stronger data protection laws, and some even incorporated digital privacy into their constitutions. The best example is perhaps Brazil's General Data Protection Law, similar in some respects to the famed EU General Data Protection Regulation. But as we learn from revelations in Latin America regarding the use of Pegasus for cyber espionage against politicians, journalists, and activists in Mexico, Latin America has a long way to go in privacy protection policy and implementation. The same is true for cybersecurity. Some governments in the region are taking this issue seriously, but obvious steps such as better regional coordination have not been prioritized, despite the massive increase in online activity during the pandemic, including among non-sophisticated users of the internet who aren't prepared to take their own steps to protect their privacy online. To discuss the landscape for privacy and cybersecurity in Latin America, I'm more than delighted to introduce this fabulous panel of experts, including the Chief Technology Officer for Global Market Development at Microsoft, Dave Sloan, who joins us from Maryland in the United States, the Head of Latin America Government Engagement at Visa, Miami-based Silvia Constain, and the Director of Brazil's National Data Protection Agency, Miriam Weimer in Brasilia. Miriam, Silvia, Dave, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Dave, I want to start with you for a broad overview of the region. I know your responsibilities are global, but they include Latin America. And the question I have is whether the report that I just referenced is fair to the region, whether its assessment that the region has not done enough in any of the major areas, including coordination internationally, regionally, in terms of the training of law enforcement, in terms of the right legislation. Is it fair to say that Latin America doesn't so far get a passing grade when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy policy?
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here on behalf of Microsoft. Admittedly, I'm grading on a bit of a curve here based on sort of the overall technological maturity of the region. Now, the threats don't discriminate between mature and immature markets, so maybe that's unfair, but I would say overall, at an early preparatory stage, the region probably gets about a B-. I'll dissect that a little bit because when you're grading privacy and cybersecurity, from my perspective and from a technology perspective, there are really only two subjects on the report card: hyperscale cloud adoption and data classification. Trying to protect privacy and advance cybersecurity without hyperscale cloud and the tools that it brings is sort of like entering a knife fight without a knife. It's your number one cybersecurity tool, period, full stop. And the costs and complexity of these robust privacy compliance regimes are almost unbearable for an individual company unless you partner with some of these market leaders, which lead to those robust protections really rapidly being adopted. So I would say as low as a B- because both cloud adoption and data classification have taken important initial steps in Latin America and certainly advanced significantly during COVID, but are still lagging other regions in the world. Why as high as a B-? Because to its credit, Latin America by and large has not thrown up the big regulatory roadblocks to modernization around issues like data residency and data sovereignty, which distract from, in my opinion, the more important issues of privacy and cybersecurity.
Interesting, Dave. So to clarify, a higher score for not having taken steps that are perhaps not necessary and would obstruct further development of digital life, and a score with some demerits for not having adopted some necessary minimum tools in terms of cloud technologies. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct. I mean, avoiding distractions is a major part of progress here, I'm sad to say, because we're all working with limited budgets, both of resources and both of financial resources and of human resources. So making sure to keep our eye on the prize is rule number one.
Miriam, I want to turn to you for a government perspective. This whole series, as you know, has mixed senior government official views with private sector views to try to get a sense of where the region is and where it's headed. You head an agency that's emblematic of Brazil's commitment to these questions. It's a historic moment, which I'll let you describe for the role of the Data Protection Agency in Brazil. Maybe just talk about the Brazil case and why the Brazilian Congress, the executive branch, have prioritized data privacy and how it's going so far in terms of your implementation, addressing private sector concerns, but also obviously consumer interests.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ben. I'm delighted to share this panel with you, with Sylvia, and with Dave. And of course, I can bring only a Brazilian government perspective. I'm sure there are other challenges throughout the region. But I think it's fair to say that Brazil has made plenty of progress over the last years, I'd say over the last decade, perhaps, beginning in 2010 when we issued our first national broadband plan, and then moving on to the approval of our Brazilian civil rights framework for the internet, Marco Civil da Internet, dealing with issues such as net neutrality, intermediary liability, content removal, which I think are super important to bring legal certainty to this environment. Then 2016, digital government strategy. And in fact, Brazil has had huge progress in terms of provision of public services through exclusively digital means. We currently have over 3,000 different public services provided only exclusively through the internet. In 2017, Brazil formally requested to join the OECD, and we have in fact carried out several peer reviews by the OECD involving digital matters, for instance, regarding our digital strategy, regarding public service through digital means, and also regarding the telecommunications sector review. In 2018, our Brazilian strategy for digital transformation, focusing on creating a cohesive policy environment for incentivizing transformation, both in public and private sectors. 2018, the approval also of our general data protection law, which is an interesting case because it was in fact broadly supported both by civil society and by the business community, which I think is an interesting aspect of our law. 2018, we also had our national information security policy, 2019, national IoT policies. In 2019, Brazil was also formally invited to join the Budapest Convention, and we are in fact going through this process now. In 2020, the Brazilian strategy for cybersecurity. And in fact, it's interesting to point out that between 2018 and 2020, Brazil in fact rose from position 70 of the global cybersecurity index to position 18 globally, which is huge progress, I think, and reflects also our efforts in creating a more stable and more clear legal environment for this issue. In 2021, our national AI strategy. And finally, in 2021, August, on Sunday, we had the final entry into force of all articles of our general data protection law, including the administrative sanctions, which were provided for, including high fines, as well as other measures. So I think it's fair to say that we have been making progress both in terms of our legal regulatory framework, but also in terms of our institutions. And perhaps the greatest example is in fact the creation of the National Data Protection Authority. We were formally created last November, so this is a very young organization, 9 months old, that's nothing. But we have in fact begun working very hard on creating the necessary rules to provide for stability, for legal certainty, and we have been very open to discussions with private sector and civil society through very open consultation processes. So I think maybe Dave's grade is a bit harsh. I'd say we have been making progress, although there's certainly lots of work still to be done.
I'll give Dave a chance to reply shortly. And I know I have to turn to Sylvia, but Miriam, I can't resist. You've just talked about what has gone into force regarding your own brand new agency. And I think it was just Sunday where these potential fines are now available as tools for enforcement of the data privacy regulations in Brazil. Maybe just take 30 seconds and explain why that's significant, the scale of these potential censures that are now, part of your arsenal, and, how it will provide, I would hope, a strong incentive for compliance.
Sure, and I think you touched upon the right issue, Ben, because our challenge is in fact incentivizing compliance in a country where we do not have a long tradition of personal data protection. So this is still a fairly new discussion in Brazil. We had a 10-year period of debates on this law in government and also in Congress. It finally came partially into force in 2018. And I think at this point, many organizations are still struggling to understand what this law actually entails and what is necessary to actually to do within their organizations in order to be compliant. And I'd like to point out that sanctions are, of course, very important. Our law allows us to apply sanctions of up to 2% of the company's revenue in the previous year, limited to 50 million reais, which is approximately 10 million US dollars. But we are very much aware that sanctions are not the only way to incentivize compliance, and perhaps not the best way. So we have been carefully discussing more responsive approaches towards incentivizing compliance. And we have also been working very hard on this role of providing guidance, of providing clarity, of creating incentives for companies to adopt accountable and responsible behavior with regard to data processing activities. So in fact, we are very much willing to explore this entire toolkit of mechanisms we have to promote compliance, and not only administrative sanctions.
Many thanks, Miriam. Sylvia, Miriam talks a lot about the need for private sector action and for companies themselves to take responsibility for many of these issues, potentially through government action, but ideally through partnership and through best practices. I wonder if you could just talk for a minute about the private sector perspective, companies big and small, when it comes to their own actions and then also what they need and expect from government authorities on privacy and cybersecurity.
Great, Ben. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with Dave and with Miriam. And this is a really timely discussion that we're having right now. Visa is a payments technology company, and as such, championing security is one of our core strategic goals. We're relentless in fortifying security of both our network and the broader payments ecosystem. And I think that's what's really important, that we recognize that securing our network is not enough. Payments takes place in a full ecosystem that includes financial institutions, it includes other payments networks, it includes fintechs, it includes processors, it includes vendors, it includes merchants, and of course, it also includes the final consumer. So it's a huge ecosystem, and every single one of the actors in this ecosystem, including of course regulators who are kind of the ones that set the whole scene and that generate the rules in which the ecosystem lives, are fundamental in making sure that we have a secure network where people can trust that the transactions that they do are transactions that are safe, that are secure, that are easy, because we all sometimes forget when we are, and I'm a former regulator, so sometimes you forget how important the user experience is, how important it is that we always think about the final user. So it's our responsibility, each one of us that is in the ecosystem, to make sure that we play our role in a collaborative way with permanent dialogue and with permanent discussions. And I'm going to kind of build on something that Dave said, which is that this is a very, very fast moving ecosystem. So it's very important for when we do have governments take measures, that we make sure that the measures are flexible enough so that they allow the private sector to be able to innovate as fast as those who might be wanting to attack the networks. And so that really does require a certain amount of flexibility and a certain amount of coordination to make sure that we're all working in the same direction. And I would say that this, I think, is even more important now after the year and a half that we've lived, where millions of people, not just in Latin America, but around the world, have gone to digital payments for the very first time. And this is not something that will be a one-off, but most of these people will actually continue the behavior of going to digital payments first. So if digital payments was something that was, I think, or digital first was something that was in everybody's kind of mind frame in the past, it's actually in people's behavior now. And that's great news to everyone, but it also does create a very real challenge, and it makes us have to work twice as hard to make sure that the facilities that we have in terms of digital payments and many other things actually are as secure as they need to be, because there are millions more now on that network and on those systems.
Before turning back to Dave, Sylvia, I did want to ask about the capabilities of companies to provide the kind of protections you're referencing. It isn't just new consumers who have come in over the last year, but lots of new startups, including in the fintech world, and also just lots of small and medium-sized enterprises that are now suddenly offering digital services, financial and otherwise. I guess my question for you is, do they have the tools and sophistication to do what a company like Visa can, one of the largest players in its sector? And if not, how can they get those tools, get that knowledge, get the support required?
Well, Visa is a company that invests billions in its security. It's a company that's global. So you use your Visa card in one country that is issued from another country on the other side of the globe. So we have over 50 years of experience in this. And we work with these new actors in the ecosystem. So we work continuously with fintechs, we work work continuously with new actors in the ecosystem to make sure that they too provide or have the levels of security that the ecosystem requires. So working with companies like Visa is one of the ways that you can make sure that you do have the security as you offer your services, because we do have that know-how, we do have that technology, and we work continuously with new entrants into the ecosystem to make sure that we do maintain a secure ecosystem.
Thanks, Sylvia. I want to remind everyone to please continue sending in your comments and questions. Remember, you can do so on Twitter through direct message or by tagging at LATAMPROG, at LATAMPROG, or by email to lap@wilsoncenter.org. That's LAP for Latin American Program. I want to turn to you, Dave, and talk a little bit about the threat matrix in Latin America. We've talked a little bit about cyber defenses and cyber responses, but we haven't talked about, what the level of threat is in the region. I mentioned in my introductory remarks that it's a region that traditionally has seen a great deal of fraud. I know I took a look at the latest report from LexisNexis Risk Solutions, the cybercrime report for July to December 2020. It notes that LATAM continues to record the highest daily attack rates of all regions in the world. Dave, why is that? What's the threat scenario? Why are we even talking about this subject? Is there a real threat to contend with in Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, on the green, yellow, red scale, the threat is somewhere above fuchsia. I mean, it's extreme right now. And that's not unique to LATAM, that's worldwide. I think what we're finding is that, first of all, these are motivated, well-resourced attackers. They come in every flavor, from what we call, script kiddies, people who are able to download very powerful infiltration tools just off the internet for free, all the way up to, well-funded, well-organized state actors and everything in between. And we find them coming after everything from sort of small dollar ransomware attacks all the way up to, sophisticated industrial and state-sponsored espionage that is able to exfiltrate large amounts of citizen data, of privacy data, of health data, to the point where they're actually compromising the ability of states to run in certain instances. I mean, we have an incident in Europe unfolding right now where vaccinations have stopped. And the ability to show the results of vaccinations have stopped due to a ransomware attack. And, LATAM is in a position where they have rapidly adopted an enormous amount of technology. But I'll tell you, both from a privacy and a cybersecurity perspective, it's very difficult to bake these in after the cake is already out of the oven. When these systems are already complete, to try to backport privacy controls and cybersecurity protections into them is extraordinarily difficult. It's very important to have those be part of the specifications and part of the requirements up front. And that's where you need, just to reference your earlier question, you need the assistance of global leaders in this. Small companies cannot take this challenge on. The threats are too diverse, too relentless, the volume and velocity of them are too great for individual companies to take this on. You need to ally yourselves with the folks who are investing billions of dollars in security research and have that 24/7, 365 monitoring that is really your only hope at not being compromised. I'll add one more thing, is that, I would have tremendous distrust towards any reported attacks or any statistics you see on reported attacks. Unfortunately, companies tend to sweep these things under the rug. They tend to see them as either embarrassing or undermining trust with their partners or their customers, and most of them go undiscovered. We have infiltrations that go on for years and years before they're uncovered, and they do a lot of horizontal hacking, which says once they're into one company, rather than reveal that, they use it to hack into partners and other portions of that company. So, we're seeing very much the tip of the iceberg of this problem, and it deserves all of the urgency and hyperventilation that it gets.
Dave, I thought the example of a ransomware attack that disrupts a vaccination drive to be really compelling. I wonder in Latin America if you've seen other examples, whether it's the disruption of public utilities, whether it's massive data breaches exposing private information or financial information. I mean, has this been a phenomenon that Latin America is so far keeping kind of under control, but just barely, or are all the threats that I referenced earlier really producing, disruptive attacks within this region in everyday life?
No, I think disruptive attacks are a daily reality right now. And whether they get reported on, whether they get disclosed even, should not distract us from the reality of the pace and the impact. Some of them just go on below the radar at the rate of, a couple of Bitcoin per attack. But when you aggregate that up to the massive disruption and to the massive cost of them, it's a crisis.
Miriam, I wanted to turn back to you to try to get a sense of how regulators are balancing a lot of the issues that we've already discussed. I mean, so Dave has presented, I think, a very terrifying description of the threat that governments and individuals and companies face in the region. Sylvia has not downplayed it, but certainly has said that you don't want to thwart innovation and you want to make sure that companies still have the ability to adapt and innovate at the pace that these threats arise. One of the issues maybe I'll point to specifically, Miriam, but I'm interested in your broader view, is the question of data flows across borders and whether the regulations that you are supervising permit that, and whether in efforts to protect personal data, companies might be undermining their ability to operate region-wide or internationally. Just as a one important, but only one example of many of this kind of balancing act that regulators like you, Miriam, are forced to grapple with as you protect privacy, but also try to promote the expansion of digital technologies.
I think it's a great question, Ben. And I think that nowadays, when we look at digital transformation policies, a key aspect is, in fact, building trust in the digital economy. So we feel it's not possible to promote an environment where there is innovation, where there are international data flows, if there is also not trust that this data will not be mishandled, that it will not be leaked without consent of the data subject or any other legal basis. So in Brazil, when we began discussing our national digital transformation strategy, we very clearly put the issue of trust at the center of our strategy. And this involves, of course, both data protection laws, but also cybersecurity issues, as well as consumer protection, I would add. So when we look at the general data protection law in Brazil, we see that there is clearly an effort to balance these different issues. So on one side, promote an environment which is open to innovation, which allows data to flow, bringing convenience and bringing positive aspects to society. On the other hand, the need for this data to be protected. And in Brazil, very similarly to Europe, we have this idea of a fundamental right to data protection. So data is always associated to the individual, and the individual should be in control of what happens to his or her data. Discussing specifically the issue of international data flows, I think it's fair to say that our law does not have a restrictive approach to data flows, but we do have the need for several safeguards in order to allow data to be transferred internationally and to remain protected. So for instance, we have the possibility of adequacy decisions, such as the GDPR also has, but we also have a number of other legal grounds and safeguards that allow data to be transferred under sort of private mechanisms, for instance, standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, seals, certifications, code of conduct. And we have, in fact, begun working on these issues, specifically on standard contractual clauses, because adequacy, of course, has political and diplomatic components that sometimes may take some time. But SCCs are perhaps the way forward in the short term, because they are an off-the-shelf solution that larger companies, but also smaller organizations can very easily incorporate and thus allow data to be transferred international, but remain protected. So this is something we have included in our regulatory agenda to be addressed next year, but we have already, in fact, begun these conversations with public stakeholders, with DPAs in other countries, but also with private sector organizations in order to figure out what the best approach would be for Brazil.
Miriam, I've got to call you on being a little too technical in some of those descriptions and just ask if you could tell 30 seconds of what you mean by adequacy decisions, SCCs, which I think stands for standard contractual clauses, just 30 seconds on why those are significant, what you may or may not have learned from Europe and what you're implementing in Brazil.
Sure, sorry about that. Adequacy decisions happen when one country formally recognizes that another country has a legal framework, a legal environment that is sufficiently protective of personal data. So this is a very European standard, I think. Europe has in fact issued, I think, 14 or 15 adequacy decisions, including here in Latin America, Uruguay and Argentina. if I'm not mistaken. So our law also has the possibility of Brazil recognizing other countries as being adequate in terms of their legal environment, and this would allow data to flow in an unrestricted manner between these jurisdictions. Of course, adequacy decisions are tricky because they require a very in-depth assessment of another country's legal scenario. So we have also been working on these other mechanisms which are sometimes called safeguards. And essentially they are contractual clauses which bind the parties who wish to export data. And these parties therefore commit themselves to maintain these high standards of protection, even if the data is held in a country where there are no laws or no rules that incorporate these same high standards. So in a nutshell, that's the description. I know in the US, for instance, where you don't yet have a federal national data protection law, there has been some emphasis on these private mechanisms, these certification mechanisms, such as the APEC cross-border privacy rules, for instance. The privacy shield is no longer in functioning after the Schrems II decision, but I think this has been generally the approach. And here in Brazil, we have been working on understanding and figuring out these different approaches under the conviction that it's important to have more global interoperability, to have our mechanisms be able to work together with mechanisms in Europe, but also in the US and other jurisdictions.
Got it. Thank you, Miriam. Sylvia, we're having obviously a very general conversation that covers lots of sectors, but you're here for a reason, and not just your background and the work you're doing at Visa, but because financial sector threats are the highest in Latin America, probably globally. I think we can all guess the reason why. This is where the most money arguably is to be made by bad actors in cyber. So I wonder if you could replicate what Dave offered us broadly, but in the financial services sector in Latin America. We, as I mentioned, had an event just on fintech and how explosive the growth in financial technologies have been. Governments being able to provide a lot of these social welfare payments to the unbanked individuals, small businesses finally experimenting with digital payment systems. That's all the good side of this. Sylvia, tell me what we should be concerned about when it comes to the threat scenario, particularly in Latin America, particularly in finance.
Well, first of all, I don't want to create a panic here or anything of the sort. As you can see, and as we saw during COVID, frankly, the ecosystem responded incredibly well. So despite the fact that we did have challenges as I would say, as everyone, as a globe, as companies, as individuals, the fact is that COVID and the pandemic does bring also an opportunity. I would say that the immediate response with the pandemic was focused on maintaining business continuity, on mitigating the client impact and the impact on small and medium-sized businesses of what the pandemic brought. And now I think that we have to shift as an ecosystem. And as I said, that includes regulators, it includes networks like Visa, it also includes fintechs, and it includes merchants and even end users. We now have to think about risk strategies that promote payment security. So we had this first situation where we were all engrossed in trying to make sure, one, that we could, pay for our day-to-day things without having the what in that moment was the danger of physical contact with money. And now that we've kind of gone through this emergency situation, we do all have to sit down and, as Dave and Miriam have both alluded to, think about this in a systemic way. So networks like Visa, as I said, I'm gonna just change this a bit. Cybersecurity doesn't just happen. We have to be purposeful about it, and everybody has a role to play. So everything from helping people use and protect their passwords, change their passwords, knowing where to use their payments credentials, and how to detect things when it's not really normal and you shouldn't. If somebody asks you for a password, you have to be aware that that is completely unnormal and shouldn't be happening. So there's a lot that we can do now. As the pandemic, I think, showed that we were ready for it, but as millions more come into the system, then we have to be even stronger. we have to work even faster. The issue of cross-border data flows becomes even more urgent in terms of allowing them to happen in a seamless manner so that we can do all these verifications. Because when you're thinking about a network, a payments technology network like Visa, when we check your credentials, it's not that we go to one file. There are millions of reviews that we do at the same time to have the ecosystem continue to work. So to that, I would say the good thing is that we have the technology, we have the services to enable small and medium enterprises to access the digital payments ecosystem securely, safely, and seamlessly. We have the services to allow even more people to receive digital payments and to use digital payments. I think that when we look at the amount of people that received government disbursements digitally, and that this was the first time that they had ever received a payment digitally, that is a magnificent opportunity, because what we have to do now is make sure that we do the most to promote that they stay in the digital ecosystem, that they, beyond using the digital payment system to just receive the disbursement, they start using it to pay, whatever they need, but also to go into the digital ecosystem and start learning another language, or there's so much that the internet has to offer and that digital has to offer. And this, I think, was a great way to kind of open the door to many who maybe would have taken many, many more years before they got into digital.
Interesting, Sylvia. We'll return to this question of consumer behavior, not only what you're describing, which is some putting your toes into the water in using digital technologies, but also the behaviors that you referenced. I do want to talk to you a bit later, and you, Miriam, as well, about the importance of educating consumers and users themselves, and not only from a government and business standpoint. You talked about sort of good online hygiene when it comes to passwords. There's a lot to educate consumers about. Before that, I want to remind everyone that you should continue sending in your excellent questions. You can participate again by reaching out on Twitter through direct message, or by tagging at LATAMPROG, LATAM Prog, or by email to lap@wilsoncenter.org. So please continue sending in your ideas and questions. Dave, I want to stop for a second and talk about the role the United States is playing in promoting best practices from a policy standpoint in Latin America. I guess maybe two-part question: is the United States have best practices to export when it comes to a lot of these issues? Where is the United States in its capabilities? Is it doing, what Miriam is doing? And if so, is it effective? If not, why not? But also, I noted that the National Security Advisor is taking his first trip to Latin America of the Biden administration. And if you look at the list in the delegation, you see that it is technology heavy. And you have a senior National Security Council director for cyber will be here, as well as a senior director for technology and national security. Obviously, these issues are on the minds of the national security folks in the Biden White House. So maybe answer both those questions, Dave, if you would. How's the United States doing? And importantly, what role, if any, is the US playing in Latin America in promoting good practices on cybersecurity and on digital privacy?
Yeah, it's very exciting to see that. And I think mostly because it confirms the tenet that we have grown to know, which is that cybersecurity is national security. These are not separate issues. But the United States is a little bit of a tale of two cities on this front. As Miriam pointed out, we are lagging the world from a privacy perspective, and the fact that we don't have a national privacy law is preventing us from being able to take advantage of adequacy decisions in Europe and other places that are following that model. And that's a shame. And that's something that we certainly as Microsoft are advocating on behalf of. We've taken some individual steps in places like California and Washington State, but we're behind. From a cybersecurity perspective, the United States is certainly an avatar. And I'll focus on something very specific and somewhat technical, but I think really important, which is the single largest leap forward that I think the United States took in cybersecurity was aligning with international standards, which is not always a place that the US, plays nicely in the sandbox. But when NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Testing, decided to align its cybersecurity standards with the International Standard Organization, the ISO 27000, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, That's a huge message to the world that says, you're not that special, right? Cybersecurity doesn't necessarily need to be tailored to local cultural norms. When you start your own flavor, you're creating a disincentive both internally and externally within your market for adoption. Standards are your friends. These are worked out internationally, and when they take that global perspective into account. That needs to be, the standards are one thing. The enforcement and monitoring and auditing of that standards is another. And that can be a tremendous difficulty, especially for smaller countries and smaller companies, which is why, you have a choice. You can either grow your own 800-pound gorilla, or you can rent somebody else's 800-pound gorilla, but you're going to need a gorilla in this fight to help you sustain your cybersecurity advances here. But I would say that that first technical step of aligning with international standards seems like a small one, but it's actually a pivot point that has a tremendous cybersecurity benefit.
Miriam, I want to ask you about the international collaboration, the regional collaboration that could be useful here. Dave has talked about importing international standards. There's also this very rich question about working with others, not only the development of standards and the harmonization of standards, but from a law enforcement perspective as well, from training, from just a recognition that this is maybe the most essential cross-border issue you could imagine across the board. And just what support, if any, have you gotten as you've developed, this data protection agency? What cooperation are you giving to others that may be seeking to replicate your model? What, if anything, do you get from the United States, where the United States has advantages, Dave says, on cybersecurity and certainly not on data privacy protection? Tell me, Miriam, just the international aspects of your work.
Sure, Ben. And I think it's inevitable to speak about the international implications of data privacy when we realize that our growing digital economy is, of course, essentially transnational and based on international data flows. So in fact, when ANPD was created, we had nothing. We had only 5 directors who were appointed, and we had a meeting room, and that was it. And over these past 9 months, we have been, in fact, working very hard to build these basic structures and procedures that would allow us to operate in an effective manner. And we have been very fortunate to have great cooperation internationally. So we have an ongoing discussion with the FTC, for instance. We have already had meetings with them. We've been discussing the Apex CBPR mechanisms, for instance. We have a very good relationship with the European Commission, and they have in fact also provided training to our staff members through the Maastricht University, which is a very well-known international university for privacy and cybersecurity. We have been taking measures to join the Global Privacy Assembly and the GPEN, which is the Global Privacy Enforcement Network. We also have very good bilateral relations with different regulators, such as the ICO, with the Spanish regulator, with the Portuguese regulator. So we have been gradually seeking to find our place at this table of DPAs, and I think it's been very interesting to learn from different experiences, while realizing also that Brazil has some unique characteristics. So unlike European DPAs, we are dealing with a country that has a continental dimension, over 5,500 different municipalities, 230 million inhabitants, and a very complex scenario in terms of enforcement, because besides the DPA, we also have local consumer protection authorities, over 900. So you can imagine how complicated this is. We have independent public prosecutors, we have regulatory agencies, we have different bodies, both at the federal, but also state and municipal levels, dealing with different aspects of privacy and personal data protection. So in fact, one of our focuses is to create these cooperative relationships, also both domestically, but also internationally, in order to allow us to better carry out our missions.
Miriam, Dave says when it comes to structuring some of the frameworks for data protection and cybersecurity, you can import an 800-pound gorilla, meaning there are good ideas already out there, but you can't do that necessarily with the law enforcement and investigative side. And I just wonder, do you get the sense that Brazil has, available and is investing in these capabilities? So the kind of sophisticated law enforcement resources you need to be able to police behavior online.
Right. So I'm not in a position really to comment about what the police organizations are doing, but speaking from the perspective of our national DPA, what we have been doing is realizing that since we don't have an 800-pound gorilla, we need to establish cooperation mechanisms with other organizations who do. So we already have cooperation agreements with our national antitrust body, also with our National Secretariat for Consumer Relations and with the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. We are working closely together also with regulatory agencies such as the telecom regulator, the electric energy regulator, and others. So I think that while we realize that ANPD is a very small organization, we are now currently up to 40 members, including the 5 directors. So it's really a very small organization. It is possible to be effective if we work in partnership with other bodies who have perhaps larger capabilities than we do at this point in time.
Many thanks, Miriam. Sylvia, I promised to return to this question of the consumer's responsibility, but also the responsibility of companies and governments in educating all these new digital users in how to, more safely guard their own privacy and to ward off cyber attacks. Maybe Sylvia, you could talk a bit about these questions again about proper online hygiene and the role that companies, big and small, and governments can play in educating and training individual consumers. And again, particularly the very small businesses and the new consumers who in Latin America have very much for the first time embraced online technologies, and who, if they have a bad experience during the pandemic, might not return to these tools again or expand their online life.
Thank you, Ben. I mean, that is a great question. And I think there we have a shared responsibility. There is no one who is an actor in the digital ecosystem that should not be promoting a healthy digital ecosystem and good behavior within that digital ecosystem. Companies like Visa have a lot of resources for small and medium enterprises, for merchants, for people that help train in the use of our products, that help train in how to how to have financial literacy, and digital literacy is part of financial literacy nowadays. So besides the fact that most of the companies are working very hard to create content that will help their users use their services better and more safely and more securely, parents have a role to play, employers have a role to play, and just in general, citizens have a role to play in terms of talking about what it means to be a digital first community, which is where we're going. And so, as I said, each company has our content, which we are putting forth for our users and consumers to use and to really appropriate in the way that they do business. But additionally, I do think that it is something that we have to work with governments, that we have to work with the international community, and that should be part of not just conversations like ours that we're having right now, but really go down to schools, to universities, and to all the different types of ways that we can get to the citizens in general. I personally think that the fact that there was such a large amount of government disbursements over the pandemic is an opportunity. That is right now, which we probably didn't have before, we have ways of reaching millions of citizens that maybe were difficult to reach before because we're not banked or we didn't have a way to reach them. But thanks to the pandemic, we now do. We've been able to disperse payments through the digital ecosystem. We can use these tools to try to help to promote or to share all this information and all this content. So there's a lot to do. As I said, the pandemic brought some really, really hard challenges, but it also, I think, gives us wonderful opportunities to move this ecosystem forward faster.
Many thanks, Sylvia. Let me remind everyone that we have a couple more minutes and are still open to more of your questions. You've sent in excellent ones so far. Please reach out by direct message or tagging on Twitter at LATAMPROG at LATAMPROG, or by email to lap@wilsoncenter.org. Dave, I wanted to turn to you and ask a question about enforcement and implementation. I think we focused a lot on structures here, on what institutions have countries set up, on what laws have they passed, on paper, how does it look like the governments in Latin America are addressing these issues. But what about when it comes to actual enforcement? It's too early to judge Miriam, the institution is too new, the enforcement authorities are only now 3 days old, but others are, for example, in Peru, the National Data Protection Authority has developed a reputation for auditing and enforcing compliance in a very active way, others perhaps less so. My question, Dave, is are we focusing too much on structures and on what things look like on paper? And should we think about other metrics for recognizing if governments are actually ambitious enough in this area?
No, I don't think we're focusing too much on it, because clarity is critical in establishing a successful business environment, right? Businesses cannot thrive if they don't know exactly what they're complying with. So setting clear rules up front is an absolute prerequisite. Now, we can't have paper tigers either, and we need that enforcement capability to be robust and to be consistent and to be transparent. I think if we aspire to even more than that, what we would love to see is to have it be collaborative rather than punitive, because ultimately the goal in certainly privacy enforcement, the goal is not to bring wrongdoers to justice, right? The goal is to prevent consumers from further being exploited by these abusive processes. So the goal should always be to, in my sense, to remediate rather than to try to punish. And I don't know specifics on Latin American enforcement policies here, so I'm really characterizing it globally. But I think we find it most effective if the effect that you're measuring is the effect on consumer protection. The more collaborative it is, and the more tools that are provided in order to assist people to comply with it, rather than just looking for opportunities to levy these significant fines, it's ultimately more productive for consumers. But again, I wouldn't view the important upfront work as a distraction from that work. Ultimately, if we want these fines to stick and we want the behaviors to change, then we need these to be upheld in court. And that only comes if we have clarification and consistent enforcement along the entire way.
Many thanks, Dave. Miriam, actually, I want to ask a question of you and Sylvia. You can answer in turn, starting with you, Miriam, which is about regional harmonization of policies. We've talked for a while here about companies and governments working together to make sure that the policies are clear, as Dave mentioned, that they don't inhibit innovation, as Sylvia has emphasized, but that they do provide protection so that all these new internet users, remain online, expand their payments, relationships beyond receiving government emergency supports. One of the priorities, though, for lots of companies, multilatinas and multinational companies, is that you can easily operate, across the region, and to do so fluidly require some harmonization. That at least is a common argument you hear from large firms. Miriam, is that a priority at all for you, or for all the reasons you've already mentioned, is Brazil too big, too complicated, too idiosyncratic for you to really be thinking about harmonization?
No, I do think it's really important, Ben, and I do think there's still lots of work to be carried out in this field. So for several years now, I've been following efforts in this sense. We had, for instance, the ELAC initiative, which sought to build a digital agenda for Latin America. We have in the field of data protection, the Ibero-American Network for Data Protection, Rede Ibero-Americana de Protección de Datos. And I think there are still many challenges, particularly when you look at the different regimes for taxation, for instance, or for imports and exports, as well as the different legal frameworks. So I do think it's important. I think there is a trend in Latin America of adopting laws that are inspired by the GDPR. We already have Uruguay and Argentina with adequacy decisions, for instance. Now Brazil has its own European approach, general data protection law. So I would say this is perhaps a trend. And it is important, but I think we're still not there yet. I think there's still lots to be done.
Sylvia, again, from a company like yours operating everywhere in the region, how important is harmonization when you think about the operating environment for privacy in particular, but also cybersecurity?
Ben, it's fundamental. I mean, it's essential because for many reasons. Let's start with the beginning, and it's that the threats that we face in terms of cybersecurity are actually very similar worldwide. It's not that you go from one country to another and the attack varies from one to the other. In fact, in many cases, the attacks actually come from another country. So this is an area where governments need to collaborate and to cooperate. And as I said, as they do so, to make sure that what decisions are made are flexible enough so that the private sector can continue to innovate, can continue to bring in new ways to protect our users and our ecosystem. I mean, I think that the word trade agreements, maybe we've gone beyond that. It's not just about trade, or it is in terms of when you think about going from one country to the other, but it's actually global agreements. It's global agreements about standards like the ones that Dave was speaking about, which are so important. It's agreements about helping companies that move from their services from one country to the other to do that seamlessly, so that we can also, as companies, invest the resources that we have where we create the most value versus investing resources and trying to figure out the many different scenarios that you might have from one country to another. And then finally, this is really important when we're talking about helping medium and small businesses go from one country to another. I mean, if it's difficult for a company like Visa to be able to understand the different frameworks in each one of the countries, can you imagine what it's like for a small business or a medium-sized business who wants to go from, you know, say, provide their services or their goods from one country to another? That creates a really difficult situation for these companies. So I think that from a growth perspective, from an internationalization perspective, harmonization is something that governments should be doing. They should be working actively at it. And if we don't want to call them trade agreements, that's fine. But these agreements that help really us all be global players are very important for growth and for creating new and better paying jobs.
Really important point, Sylvia, in our fintech conversation that we held in the dLocal CEO, we talked a lot about particularly companies in a relatively small market like Uruguay, but companies in general in the tech space. The idea is that they can cross borders much more easily and spread much more widely. But you're right, I think you're pointing out some potential obstacles to that. Dave, we started with you. We're going to finish with you for a broad perspective. Just if you would prioritize for us what you think the region should be focusing on. Obviously, there's a lot on the plates of policymakers in Latin America with the economic and public health challenges continuing, and with all the different aspects of cyber and privacy. You started us out by giving a little sense of what matters most. Why don't you give us, 2 or 3 next steps that you would recommend for governments and lawmakers in the region to prioritize going forward to get a handle on this issue?
Look, I recognize how full everyone's plates are, but these issues will not wait. We've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And cybersecurity is not something that you can push off and get around to solving later. It will eat you alive. So yes, I mean, we can say, get cloud friendly. Cloud is going to be your friend in terms of, serving as a platform for people to be able to rapidly address cybersecurity issues. That means adopting cloud first policies, framework agreements to accelerate procurement, national skilling plans, all that stuff. On the privacy side, absolutely invest in data governance and classification. It's a little bit more technical, but it allows people to quickly move their data according to clear guidelines and not in a bespoke fashion, company by company, use case by use case. But knowing that we also have policymakers who are listening today, let me focus on one really practical piece of advice, and that is to keep the technical details of IT control frameworks out of legislation. What gives practitioners like me heartburn when we come in and try to help a country's public sector address these critical issues is when we see criteria written into law that are obsolete, sometimes decades old. Technology and the threats both move faster than even the most nimble parliament. So set high-level objectives in legislation, leave the nitty-gritty for regulation, and please leave room for experimentation in individual agency policy that can adopt and adapt much more quickly than the legislative frameworks can. The last thing I would say is ask for help. There are great models out there. Everybody's happy to share them. We are all in this together. There's no reason to go it alone.
Dave, Miriam, Sylvia, this has been fascinating, insightful, and super relevant to challenges Dave points out that cannot wait to be addressed. I want to thank all of you again. Thank you everyone for participating and sending in your questions for this conversation. Thanks again to our partners and co-sponsors, ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council. I direct you again to our website. You can watch previous Going Digital seminars that we've held addressing these and related issues about the digital future of Latin America. You can also find information on our next Going Digital event. It's on August 17th. It will be a discussion on remote education in Latin America in partnership with ITI and Zoom. Thank you again for being here, Miriam, Sylvia, Dave. It's been fascinating. Let's continue this conversation in the future.
Thank you so much, Ben.